Hello and good morning, everyone. We're going to get started. I think we have about 45 people on, including the Forest Service. So I'm hoping we can start our 2-hour Great American Outdoors Act project implementation conversation with the Forest Service. I want to remind everyone that this conversation will be recorded for our partners and press, so please keep that in mind. And also, please introduce yourselves in the chat function, your name and organization. We are going to have about 60 to 70 folks on this call, so we won't have time to do around the room introductions, but we'd love to know who's on and to keep the chat function going throughout this conversation. So with that, I'm Jessica Wall, the Executive Director of the Outdoor Recreation Roundtable, the nation's leading outdoor business coalition. We have 33 national association members serving over 110,000 outdoor recreation businesses. And I know I speak for our members and our partners on the call with a sincere thank you to the United States Forest Service leadership team for this conversation today. I know that you've spent a lot of time on this presentation and thinking through how you can get feedback and prepare for public comment and invite groups like us and us invite you to these conversations. And so we really appreciate your time and are excited for today's discussion on the implementation of Great American Outdoors Act. So just a little run through of the agenda. Hopefully you all received the handouts that I sent on Friday. Today we'd like to start with a presentation from the Forest Service on where they're at with GAOA implementation. Then we'd like to have a brief background conversation on recreation's role with GAOA and where we see recreation fitting into the big backlog picture. We'll have a quick run through of FY21 projects and then a look forward at the FY22 and beyond, what we can be looking forward to in the next 3 to 4 years of the rollout of the Legacy Fund. And then we'll have some guided discussion and open it up for questions from everyone on this discussion. So we'll do questions via the chat as they come up throughout the presentations. And then at the end, we'll have a broader discussion. We'll have room for questions in the chat as well as the raise hand feature. So either way works for us, but please name an organization when you do ask questions. Some guiding topics for today's discussion: our learnings from the FY21 projects and rollout process, the overall Forest Service and administration goals for deferred maintenance over the next few years, the state of the current FY22 projects that are getting prioritized and the rollout public engagement plan for those, equity and economy as part of the deferred maintenance conversation, and maximizing public-private partnerships to get really good quality work done and ensure that these places don't get back on the DM backlog in the future, as well as the future of this fund and possibly reauthorization. We know we're not going to be able to do everything with the allocated dollars over the next 4 years. And so how do we ensure that this is a successful effort that can get more funding in the future? So with that, I'm really excited to have Jeff Vail here with us from the Forest Service, the Senior Team Lead for GAOA, Deputy Director for Recreation Heritage and Volunteers, as well as Jennifer Eberlein, the Associate Deputy Chief for the entire National Forest Service System. You have both done so much work on this, and we're so grateful for your time. And I'll hand it over to you all for your conversation.
I tried to attack one of the guys. And they came running in, and then they told us they had these cameras so they could see it.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much, Jessica. First, if somebody could mute their phone, there seems to be somebody that has a phone unmuted.
But otherwise, I mean, if they're just trying to use it to spy on you, I'd throw a shot cloth over.
Bill, mute your phone.
You're not hurting it. You're not damaging it.
There you go. Thank you.
Over to you, Jen.
Hi, everyone. Yes, that was me. Thank you very much, Phil. And Jessica, thank you for that great introduction. Again, Jennifer Eberlein, I'm Associate Deputy Chief with the National Forest System in the Forest Service in our Washington office, and just really looking forward for the next couple of hours spending time with everyone. And I just want to start out just saying thank you. Thank you so much for your interest, for your support. I know many organizations were a big part of gaining the support for Great American Outdoors Act, and just want to thank you on behalf of the Forest Service and all of the partners and our Forest Service employees that you have on here today. So really looking forward to having the dialogue as Jessica had laid out. And, you know, you guys all know that, you know, the first visitor's experience can make a lasting impression on how they view and what they think of and how they look at public lands and national forests in this case in specific. So we want to all have that very positive, inclusive, welcoming environment for our visitors where they want to come back again and again, and they want to bring people with them and have a greater experience on our public lands as well. And so as part of that, for having that healthy, safe, infrastructure and an environment to be in is a critical part of that. So it's not only being able to have those visitor experiences, have that support, have the economic development that we have, the investments that we have, being able to provide other portions and other parts of the Forest Service work that we have with all of you is a key component of that. And so to do that, we really need to have that support for deferred maintenance. And again, critical act like Great American Outdoors Act with their funding aspects of it is just going to be such a key for us to improve that experience in our infrastructure. So very much looking forward to hearing from all of you of how we can improve our process and keeping you up to date as the best way to be transparent about where we are at too, and have further engagements as we move along on this. And then I just want to acknowledge, folks, that you are giving us the one thing that none of us can get back, and that is time. So spending 2 hours together is so important. And I just want to acknowledge that you are doing that and giving that to us and to this effort. And just want to thank you for that as well. So I'm keeping this short so I can get this back over to Jeff and we can have a greater time for conversation and dialogue. So I'll turn it over to you, Jeff. Again, thanks everybody. Look forward to the next couple of hours.
Thanks, Jen. As has already been said, thank you for joining us today. This morning, I'm going to go ahead and go through a few slides to give you some context and orient you to the program itself and how the Forest Service has implemented the Great American Outdoors Act thus far. We are continuing a process that began last fall with listening sessions that we in the Forest Service hosted. We're grateful for the roundtable stepping forward to convene and facilitate today's call. Without the Outdoor Recreation Roundtable, it's fair to say that the Forest Service would not be part of this authority and would not be the beneficiary of these funds. So we cannot thank the Roundtable enough for all that they continue to do in support of outdoor recreation on the national forests. I think in the interest of time, we'll go ahead and get into the presentation, and partway through this will transition over to the Outdoor Recreation Roundtable as they have some materials to share as well. We'll be going over the organization of our agency and how we're applying our particular structure to implementing this act, talking about some of the guiding principles in the statute and how we're setting out our priorities. We'll talk about the implementation that we've already carried out to date, and then talk about going forward how we can collaborate and you can engage at all levels of the agency with respect to the projects and overall program. Next slide, please. I know and recognize on this call that we have a variety of experience working with the Forest Service. Some you've worked with us many, many years, and others fairly new to working with us. So just briefly, we are an agency, the largest agency within USDA. Our national office is led by the Chief of the Forest Service, Vicki Christensen, and we are divided by regions, of which we have 9 covering the entire country. And then within that, we have over 150 national forests and grasslands. And then within each forest and grassland, those units are divided up by ranger districts. We can go to the next slide. I wanted to, before I get into this further, I almost neglected to introduce my colleague and the deputy for implementing the Great American Outdoors Act team, Sherry Reeves. I'll just invite Sherry to come on the screen and say hello to introduce herself to you.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Sherry Reeves. I'm the Deputy Director of the Great American Outdoors Act team. So excited to be joining the team. This is actually my first week, so be kind. And thanks, Jeff, for allowing me to introduce myself.
Thanks, Sherry. It's great to have Sherry aboard. So getting back to the presentation, I mentioned 9 regions of the Forest Service. You see here how those are broken out. We manage close to 200 million acres of the national land base, about 8% of the nation's lands. And the bulk of our land base, of course, is in the Western United States. Next slide, please. Part of the Great American Outdoors Act includes full funding for the Land and Water Conservation Fund, a land conservation authority that dates back to the 1960s. We will not be doing a dive into LWCF today. If you have questions or comments, feel free to share them. Just know that we will continue to have some listening sessions devoted to LWCF separate and apart from today's discussion. You'll note per the slide that the Great American Outdoors Act commits to full funding of LWCF at $900 million per year on an ongoing basis. We manage 2 programs, one, the Forest Legacy Program, working with states to keep working forests in private land ownership and in forest status, and the other land acquisition program to acquire lands and interest in land within the National Forest System land base. Next slide, please. If we can go to the next slide. I'm guessing there may be a glitch in the slide.
This is Marcia. Yeah, it looks like you can't see the slides advancing, but if you go back one more slide, back to the slide before. Yeah, so Jeff, it's on National Park and Public Land Legacy, LRF.
Okay, great. Thank you. Appreciate that, Marcia. So the Legacy Restoration Fund part of the Great American Outdoors Act, our subject for today, is focused on deferred maintenance, of which our backlog exceeds $5 billion. Congress recognized some years ago that this deferred maintenance backlog applies to all of the federal land management agency service. Deferred maintenance backlog is by far the largest. They are the recipient of 70% of these funds. And then the remaining 15% is divided between 3 interior land management agencies. We're planning for $285 million annually over the 5-year life of GAOA. And that is the amount of money that was appropriated for fiscal year 21. The statute, the law says no more than 65% of, no more than 35% of GAOA funds may go toward transportation projects, which we interpret to be roads and bridges. Trails are considered non-transportation assets. These are no-year funds. They don't expire at the end of the fiscal year, which provides us a good deal more flexibility given the contracting and agreement challenges. And I'll talk a bit more about our priorities and leaders' intent, but just know that for us, in addition to reducing deferred maintenance, improving the overall quality of the visitor experience is what's driving our investments. Next slide, please. So what is deferred maintenance? I think before we get deeper into this, just an understanding that we're talking about maintenance that was scheduled or should have been accomplished, but was put off or delayed primarily due to lack of resources. And over time, that backlog has grown considerably. More than half of that backlog is in roads and bridges, but we have a sizable deferred maintenance backlog related to recreation sites, campgrounds, etc. Important to know that GAOA will reduce this backlog over the life of the authority, but certainly is not going to eliminate that backlog. Next slide, please. So important also to recognize that we have a number of other funding sources, not as significant as GAOA, to put toward facility maintenance, toward maintenance of our roads, toward decommissioning, toward leasing, and all of those programs, all of those funding streams are managed within the Forest Service under one asset management program. Agency leadership is part of or comprises the Asset Management Review Board. So our decisions, our policies, our process in terms of how we implement GAOA is informed by and governed by this board. Next slide, please. The Act itself is considered to be a major program. Congress 5 years ago passed a Program Management Improvement Accountability Act, directing all federal agencies to manage major programs according to best practices and principles related to program and project management. And so we're working hard with the department, with OMB, to ensure that we have appropriate plans and strategies in place to manage GAOA in a way where we're accountable. We have governing documents that ensure proper oversight. And basically, we're incorporating best practices that the private sector has been employing for some time now. Next slide, please. So at the outset, when the act was signed into law last August, Chief Christensen provided us with some broad understanding of leaders' intent. Among those, that our process, our program be transparent and accountable, that our shared stewardship approach to working with state and local governments, with outside parties, with an eye toward not just our land base, but the impacts and implications of what we do beyond our lands, that our funds be equitably distributed. And part of that is about how we benefit communities and distribute our investments widely throughout the national forest system. But there's more to it than that, and I'll get into that later. Health and safety, we have a number of facilities that desperately need improvement to simply protect and ensure the public is safe. And then, of course, how do we benefit jobs and economic development through our investments, through who gets to put these contracts and agreements into operation, and how that will create additional employment opportunities once projects are complete. And again, what's the overall quality of the visitor experience, from the restroom being used to the signage, to the condition of our rec sites, how well our trails and bridges are maintained, etc. Next slide, please. Many values associated with improving the visitor experience, many ways in which this is manifested. I'll just mention a few. Accessibility. People with disabilities are identified specifically in GAOA, so investments that improve accessibility, whether they be trails that are brought up to standard or rec sites and access, those are critical. How are we able to improve forest management, vegetation and fuels management opportunities by improving road and bridge construction? How do we better serve communities that have not been traditionally as well served and well represented as has been the case for other communities? And the President's executive order on underserved communities most definitely informs that consideration. I've already mentioned public safety, and just a recognition in terms of new or improved experiences that we saw a great increase in visitors, many first-time visitors to the National Forest last year, related to the impact from the pandemic. And we recognize now more than ever the quality of our infrastructure, our facilities, is how people experience and know the National Forest. So it's imperative that we improve the condition of our facilities. Next slide, please. I've mentioned already the investments that will benefit forest management. While recreation is certainly a major consideration, we also are looking at investments that will improve and facilitate forest management, wildfire response, and other benefits. Next slide, please. Our process for selecting and prioritizing projects has involved two parts. One, where our 9 regions identify their highest priorities, often projects that have not scored well enough to receive funding through prior programs, but that are of great importance and value to local communities. In addition, projects are submitted from all regions and they've been ranked and prioritized for additional funding. We have a number of projects that are multi-year in nature. Just the reality that the size and scale of some projects require phased implementation. So what we are funding in FY21 in some cases will receive funding in 22 and beyond. Next slide, please. Just a quick note on the timelines that we've been operating within for FY21, 22, and 23. Note that Congress in December authorized funding for 556 projects that we had submitted per the direction in the Act. We had 90 days in which to deliver a complete list of projects to Congress. And we were able to do that. We also had to prepare a list of FY22 projects for consideration by the department, by the Secretary of Agriculture last December. We are now working with the current administration to review and fine tune that list, which will be included in the president's budget submission to Congress next month. And we'll be moving ahead with the forests and regions developing project proposals for fiscal year 23 later this summer. Next slide, please. Just a quick snapshot as to how our FY21 projects have been distributed by different asset type. You'll notice the total number of projects exceeds the 556 total that I mentioned. And that's simply because the number of projects benefit multiple assets. If you look at the pie chart to the left, you'll note that our highest investment, our greatest percentage of investment is for recreation sites. 29% of our investments are targeted toward trails and bridges. And then there's a distribution. I'm sorry. I meant to say roads and bridges at 29%. And then the other percentages, the lower percentages are investments in our public facilities, dams, as well as trails and trail bridges. Next slide, please.
Have a great day. Thank you. It'll be fun to have some, yeah.
Jennifer, I think you want to go on mute. So we'll be talking more today and looking forward to your thoughts on how we can work together, how you can be more involved in this process. One of the things that has helped us, although our opportunities have been more limited, surrounds the input on specific projects. We had a public involvement effort in the fall that was confined to just 10 days for comments on projects. We were constrained by what the law required of us to deliver a complete project list to Congress. We are excited to have a more robust public involvement process at the forest level for our FY23 process. This is part of an ongoing effort to collaborate and solicit from you ideas as to how we can better implement this authority. There are ample opportunities to contract with the Forest Service to enter into agreements, whether through a conservation corps or other approach. And we will have more information available on our website as to how you can engage, our small businesses can engage with us through our contracting efforts. And there are opportunities to contribute to individual projects or to donate generally to implementation of this authority. Next slide, please. Just a quick snapshot of how we'll or how we are building out a web-based dashboard to track our accomplishments at forest level, at project level. We are aiming toward a dashboard such that you can click on any project anywhere in the system, and it will pull up the particulars of what that project is intended to do, what the status of its implementation is, additional data such as jobs created. We're really pretty excited about a robust dashboard that will be public facing, that will
Jeff, I think you froze for a minute.
And this is Marcia. I can take over from here.
Okay, great.
I'm Marcia Gillis. I'm the partnership coordinator for the GAOA strike team. So he was just finishing up about the web-based accomplishments dashboard. And yes, we do hope that we can have something more public facing and keep everyone up to date on those accomplishments. Next slide. And then, yeah, we're at the end of this presentation and we're going to open that up for questions. But as far as additional information, there is a link here on the bottom, and I'll also put that in the chat for folks to be able to go to this webpage and find out more information. And there are links to each region and the projects that we have on there. So a lot more information to come as we build out the website.
Thank you. It's amazing to see how much work has gone on since we talked, I think, last summer about some of the projects. That dashboard is going to be incredibly useful, as well as seeing that 46% of the projects are rec site projects, and there's a lot of projects that are going into trails and trail bridges, which obviously everyone on this call really cares about. So really appreciate that overview. Want to dig in more. I know there's a lot of questions. So I think we'll run through a couple more slides and then get to questions in about the next 10 minutes. I have some questions that I can guide and facilitate, but I want to make sure everyone on the line gets an opportunity to ask questions because there's a lot of information and we really appreciate you sharing that all with us.
Hey, Jess, is there any chance she could go back to that contact slide for just a second and give us a second to screenshot it?
Yeah. Can you go back one slide? Yep. Oh yeah, that's a great, and we can send out the deck as well after to everyone who registered, but this is really helpful.
This contact page has your national GAOA team, and so Jeff and all of the team members here on the left side, and then your regional office contacts are listed here on the right. And so, if you're building out projects or things of that nature, you can connect to some of your regional folks and they can get you connected to the correct forester unit.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much. We'll definitely be sure to get this out to the group. And you can keep it on the slide just for another minute, Ben, and I can get started and just some background, just level setting on how we're thinking about recreation as it pertains to GAOA and the Legacy Fund. One of the goals really of the Recreation Roundtable coming together a few years ago was to facilitate relationships with the federal government, the land and water management agencies, and to help foster collaboration as it comes to funding, access, and infrastructure. So fixing the maintenance backlog has actually been on our radar since formation and has always been a goal of all of our members, really one of the culminating factors of why we came together. So this is a huge deal for us, as I know it is with our partners on the phone. And it was really interesting because as GAOA was coming together about a little over a year ago now, as Jeff mentioned, we were part of this call to ensure that Forest Service was a key component of receiving funding from the fund. The reality is that most recreation does happen on Forest Service lands, which you all know, and the most diverse types of recreation too. So as a coalition that really represents all forms of recreation and all ways that people get outside, the forest system is really paramount to us helping our users and customers enjoy their experiences. The other interesting thing that I think ties into all of this that was happening at the same time was obviously the pandemic sweeping the nation. And during COVID, as more people needed access to safe outdoor experiences, and more businesses really saw this bill as an economic stimulus package, knowing that we weren't going to get a recreation package passed just for our companies and what they were going through. Many businesses said, an investment from the federal government in keeping these places, in good quality and ensuring good experiences is an investment in the recreation economy. So we were able to use that as we, solicited more champions on the Hill, of course, broadening the coalition because of the Forest Service was included, and really seeing two big trends in COVID that happened that I think we need to keep an eye on as we're looking at this Legacy Fund and the rollout of projects. One being more participants than ever before, right? And overuse and overcrowding in some places. Ben, you can go to the next slide. a May survey found that 81% of Americans spent time outside during COVID, and that's about 32% increase over many of the years before. And most of those were first-time users in that 32%. So we had new users, we had reactivated recreationists, and many of them said that they were flocking to the outdoors, for peace of mind, for exercise, for spending time with family, and just feeling safer that the transmission of the virus what was less when they were outside. We also know that 8 million more people hiked in 2020 versus 2019, that fishing license sales surged, shipments of RVs reached an all-time high, and power sports sales were up almost 20%. Bicycle sales were up, almost 84% year over year during November of 2020. And we know that new participation, thanks to the Outdoor Foundation's report and RBFF's great work, new participants are younger, female, and more diverse. So on the one hand, we have more people getting outside than ever before during COVID. And on the other hand, especially in the Forest Service system, we have places that are still not accessible, that are underutilized, and maybe not preferable, really because of their infrastructure. And so the new trends during COVID, have a direct link with this fund and how we think about the deferred maintenance, in that we need to understand deferred maintenance is actually getting worse, probably faster in some areas where people are flocking to in higher numbers. And at the same time, some areas probably don't have enough visitation, accessibility, or infrastructure that's in line with what the users are looking for. So I think we can solve a couple of those problems at the same time as they're probably going during COVID. Next slide. So thankfully, this bill passing couldn't have happened at a better time. And I think something that we've dug into a little bit is just how do we get a handle on the recreation backlog? And this is a pie in the sky goal, but it's something that I really like to focus on. And it's that we really can tackle a majority of the recreation backlog in the next 5 years. If we work smart, if we work together, if we think about innovative ways to do this work, if what Jeff just showed, that chart on where they are with projects will be so useful, I think, to the user community and the business community to understand how they can tap in and solicit volunteers and public-private partnership funding dollars to go to these places. But we really need to look at the non-transportation backlog, the non-building backlog, and we can achieve, fixing a lot of the recreation backlog in the next 5 years if we work together. And I think some of the ideas is creating a national strategy around the recreation backlog and really thinking about how we prioritize recreation areas that are being used or that increase accessibility to places that don't have, green spaces nearby. And also how we think of a holistic approach to this. You can go to the next slide, Ben. And that's, let's not focus on a parking lot to a trailhead if that trail has been flooded out. Let's think about the whole system, or let's not focus, on a water quality system upgrade if the campground is unusable as well. So how do we look at the entire site and make sure that it's upgraded and up to speed with what the user community wants or needs, and certainly that it's safe. We also want to address long-term resource protection and sustainability as it pertains to climate and those variables, where visitors are using sites, how we attract visitors to less used sites, and the health and safety of the visitors, as well as financial stability of these places so they don't go back on the backlog in the next couple of years. I really appreciate having the conversation with the Forest Service last summer, early fall, as most of us did. It was a short window, I think it was 10 days, but just that level of transparency and project selection and just knowing what FY21 was going to look like has been super helpful. And it looks like we'll be getting more of that transparency going forward. That's very much appreciated. And I think that's how we're going to be able to continue to help make sure that we get a handle on this backlog. And then utilizing recreation industry expertise. There's youth and veteran corps, Professional Trail Builders Association within our networks, where contractors are needed or public-private partnerships can further stimulate and improve places. And then, looking at upgrades for the next few decades and not just what today's standards are, so that we're not going back and fixing maintenance projects again in 5 or 10 years. And I think, and hopefully this comes up in the questions, and Jeff, it's something we can talk to you and your team about. Would love your ideas, but we really want a reauthorization in 4 years. And so what does that look like as it pertains to talking about projects, ribbon cutting ceremonies, events where we can celebrate what's happening with members of Congress that supported this bill? How can we showcase, like you said, the economic impact that these projects are having in rural communities. And in 4 years, how can we work together again on a reauthorization so that the Forest Service has what they need to continue to fix the maintenance backlog and keep these places open and accessible for future generations. So with that, we've got just a quick, I think, 2 slides to look at the breakdown of FY21 projects, just as it pertains to recreation from CHM. So I'm going to hand it over to Margaret Bailey.
Good morning, folks. Thanks for having us have this opportunity to spend time with you and ask questions. I think we are super excited to see the dashboard that the agency is putting together. These 2 charts that I'm going to share with the audience were put together prior to, obviously, were based upon data that was publicly available on the website early on. We're super excited to see that the agency has kind of created these recreation site, the rec asset types. Right now, you have 5 categories in the pie chart, but obviously the subcategories. Jeff, you've talked about opportunities and ideas to improve. You know, from the recreation community, it's pretty important to understand more about those rec settings. And that's what we attempted to do in this chart. We attempted to kind of drill down to the boating, fishing, cabins. You know, the heritage community, the natural resource community is interested in habitat. So if there's one recommendation we would make is to evaluate if we can get some of that data drilled down 1 extra layer, particularly on the rec settings. And then the next slide, if you want to advance, is really just a distribution of projects by state, so we can see, you know, where the projects are. Clearly on the mock-up of the dashboard, you had that information. But as we think about advocacy and forests, and we start thinking about cumulative additions of projects, so we can see what's the state looking like after 3 years of projects, you know, having that sort of state level rec setting drilled down further level is pretty important. So I think that the 2 takeaways that we could say based upon the transparency to date is figuring out if there's a way to go 1 level layer on the rec settings. And then the second thing is make sure that anything on your dashboard is easily exportable to Excel or CSV, because that's the sort of data that everybody on this phone can use more robustly in order to help advocate for the constituencies that they have. Jess?
Great, that's really helpful. And I saw Jeff taking notes. So I think this is the type of thing that hopefully we can still have input on and work back and forth to see what works best for sharing data. But I think that dashboard, in addition to our collection of project data, will paint a much clearer picture of what's happening, and that's so appreciated. With that, I just want to hand it over to Callie for our last slide before some discussion really on what we can do going forward, FY22 projects and beyond. Callie?
Thank you, Jess. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Callie Hoyt. I'm with the National Marine Manufacturers Association, founding member of ORR. Just kind of wanted to walk through, you know, some kind of key pieces that we're thinking about and hoping to work with the Forest Service on as we kind of continue moving towards execution of Great American Outdoors Act. So kind of 2 key pillars that we would like to see incorporated into, you know, goals for eliminating the maintenance backlog is first making sure that we're consistently looking at, you know, rural development. And, you know, once we get these, you know, projects, make these investments, get these projects fixed, that in and of itself becomes a rural development opportunity. And then the second key piece is, you know, expanding access. How is implementation achieving expanding access, you know, getting more visitors, getting more diverse visitors? And we think that those pieces need to be, you know, goals for this work. Utilization of industry data to select project sites. I think that this is so important, as you know, Jess touched earlier on just kind of the historic spikes in demand that recreation across the board saw last year. In the boating industry, you know, we sold more boats in 2020 than in the previous 13 years. So, you know, that just kind of gives a small snapshot on what our industry is looking at. And, you know, we want to make sure that we're able to not just accommodate that demand right now, but sustain it and grow it into the future. And this is going to play a key part in that. And so what we would like to see there is, you know, how can the private sector industry stakeholders be, providing our data, our industry data that, provides insights into the user market, so that we're able to kind of fine tooth making sure that investments are made where the demand is. And, an example of that for boating is, how are we matching up where boating registrations are to kind of identify where that demand is. And just kind of, again, making sure that when we're making these improvements to the infrastructure, that, we're not investing in places where no one might come, but let's actually, build where it's needed the most, to ensure that we're getting people there, inviting people that have never been to, for our nation's forest before. And then, as Jess mentioned earlier, including recreation in metrics for success. And I think kind of incorporating that industry data is going to really help to make that targeted approach. Another big piece here is revenue generating assets. If we can keep these, big revenue generating assets such as trail parking, campgrounds, boat launches, in good working order, people are going to want to continue to pay to get in and to come use these places. And by making those investments, we're establishing sustainable revenue streams to make sure that these that these sites are not going to, that we're going to be preventing the backlog from mounting up again. And so I think that that's going to be a kind of a key part in this strategy moving forward, is not just fixing the backlog, but how are we also building in a way that we're preventing the same situation that we needed to have addressed through Great American Outdoors Act. Incorporation of new technologies and future needs. I think I've heard a lot of collaboration and the needs there, and I think that from our standpoint, kind of a big opportunity here is that we're looking forward to working with the service on is, not just making sure that we're building to address the needs right now, but, what insights can we provide to you to help you identify, what are the needs going to be, not just now, but in the next 10 years. I think climate is a really clear example here. And, boating is, a good example to point to of, if we have a dilapidated boat launch, let's not just, build to the specs of today, but if that boat launch is in a particularly vulnerable area that is vulnerable to fluctuating water levels, let's make sure that we're building it so that it is able to adapt and be resilient to the rapidly changing environment. Another big kind of key point in terms of looking towards the future and accommodating those needs is looking towards technology advancements. While recreation is not, at the same level as the auto industry, we're starting to see market demand. It's small, but we're certainly anticipating it to grow. And so, how can the industry and private sector be working with the Forest Service to make sure that, in the next 10 years, if we have more electric boats and RVs out on our public lands, do we have the charging infrastructure up to support it? And so, where are areas where we could have electric plugins installed, again, just to make sure that we are outfitting public lands for the recreationists, not just today, of tomorrow as well. And then lastly, just to wrap up, just implementation strategy. And, I think it's clear from this conversation so far that transparency is a priority, both on the agency side, as well as as the private and stakeholder community as well. And I think the more that we can continue that dynamic in implementation, it's going to allow us to, make available the resources that we have, so that we can do our job to make sure that wherever investments are being made by the agency, we can be soliciting state, private sector investments to make sure that we're building upon the success that Great American Outdoors Act is executing, and making sure that we're really maximizing the full potential of expanding access where these projects are being completed. And so, yeah, ultimately, I think just kind of to wrap up, I think that the main point here is just that we really need to ensure that recreation is incorporated into, the goals and metrics for success. Because as Jess indicated, think, we want this program to be as successful as possible, because I think that as much as we can kind of create those metrics for success and be able to demonstrate how impactful GAOA has been in expanding access, growing the outdoor economy, that's going to really pave the way for reauthorization in 4 years. So Jess, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Callie. And I think, Jeff, I'll hand it back to your team to see if there's any reflection or thoughts or comments on the past couple minutes. And then we've got a couple questions that are coming in. I'd love to start that dialogue.
Great, thanks, Jess, and thanks for everybody that shared. There's so much to learn from everybody's input, and today's dialogue is no exception. One thing that I think is important for us all to recognize is the data that we are accessing to identify where we can achieve multiple benefits from a given investment. We need what Callie has suggested in terms of private sector data. We have a lot of that generated through our National Visitor Use Monitoring program and through other sources. We also are recognizing that with the new executive order on underserved communities, that we have to do a better job of identifying opportunities for significant benefits to communities that have a tremendous interest and desire to recreate on the national forests, don't always have the best facilities and access in which to do so. And I would just share from my own experience as a forest supervisor on the Angeles National Forest in Southern California, where in the lower watersheds of the San Gabriel Canyon, over 95% of users are from East Los Angeles and San Gabriel Valley. Overwhelmingly, first language is Spanish. A Latino community that has not always been well served by that forest in terms of the rec sites, in terms of the trails and water access. The forest prior to GAOA had begun to make some investments to improve that situation. GAOA simply positions us to do better and to provide better quality rec sites. That story is true whether you look outside the national forests around Denver or Phoenix or Albuquerque and many other places. So I just wanted to flag that we recognize there are some new priorities, some important priorities this administration is bringing forward, and we're paying attention to that in terms of where we target our investments. I think in the interest of time, Jess, I'll leave it there.
Okay, thanks. And there was a question about that 40% threshold established by the administration. So it's good to hear that you're connecting with that. I want to pass it on to Julie Broadway for a question from American Horse Council.
So good morning, I'm Julie Broadway. I'm president at the American Horse Council, and we are very interested in learning how partners and the public can best engage in the implementation of this. Specifically, we're wondering if you have some suggestions about the best ways to maximize public and private partnerships, and how can different sectors help successfully deploy the Great American Outdoors Act.
Thanks, Julie, for the question. One of the things that we're going to be sharing with you through our website is information on how you can engage in the months ahead at a forest and regional level on our project selection and prioritization process for fiscal year 23. So I would encourage you or your members to connect directly with the forests and provide your perspective either on what particular locations or what particular type of recreation facilities you consider to be highest priority. That would be one very clear-cut opportunity. In terms of partnering, public-private partnership, that is specifically referenced in the Great American Outdoors Act, and Marcia Gillis and our team is dedicated toward how we can better connect non-federal contributions and partners to individual projects. So I do think we can have a follow-up conversation with you that Marcia can carry forward for your particular interest, but more generally, I would say, again, at the forest and the regional levels where we're having these public involvement processes, share with and bring forward your ideas for where these partner investments can occur. I know, for example, on a call like this that was hosted by the National Forest Foundation last Friday, we learned from Mono County in Eastern California, for example, about how closely they're partnering with the Inyo National Forest to align some of the county priorities, some of the private sector interests of ski areas and such with some of the targeted investments that are occurring on that forest. So a lot of this is at local levels, conversations that can be carried out to connect your organization and your membership to particular projects and landscapes that need investment.
Thanks very much.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting component of this, is that there's these national conversations, which we really appreciate with national groups, but there's a lot of our organizations that have regional chapters or user communities or businesses on the local level who can, just exactly connect with regional forest managers. And I appreciate that slide with all of those contacts, because I think that's another way to really make sure that the projects make sense locally and are in line with the local. I love the counties and the mayors, getting more local buy-in as those projects are happening. With that, I'm going to pass it on to Rich from Outdoor Industry Association.
Hi, everyone. Thanks again for the discussion today. Rich Harper, Director of Government Affairs for Outdoor Industry Association. I wanted to ask you how, from your perspective, GOA implementation has changed with the new administration, specifically the Biden pillars of climate, diversity, economy, COVID, and how will these new pillars impact that implementation?
Thanks for the question, Rich. Thanks for joining today. What I can tell you is that our metrics, our criteria for how we're prioritizing projects for fiscal year 23, we've developed, I think, a better focus on what projects benefit underserved communities, looking at the CDC's Social Vulnerability Index and looking county by county at where investments are going to most benefit communities that are underserved based on that measure. In terms of climate, I know that we also have made some changes to our criteria that, for example, provide greater value for projects will address and benefit aquatic organism passage, but a number of others that are particularly addressed on how will we, for example, reduce soil impacts to watersheds when investing in a trail or a road improvement. I would say, to the extent we can align our criteria and our metrics to these two priorities of this new administration, we have begun to do so. I think, though, there needs to be, I don't want to say pressure, but voices raised at the forest and regional level as to what particular projects are important to communities, what particular investments will clearly mitigate impacts of a changing climate. And because 40% of our funds are at the discretion of each region, that's a prime opportunity, not just to influence what projects are selected there, how are they designed, who are we looking to partner with to implement those projects. We know that a lot of youth employment opportunities through the Conservation Corps can benefit and address the priority of this administration toward creating jobs in rural economic development. So I would say there are multiple prongs, some of which we've already activated and some that require us to work together to lean into what projects will best serve the priorities that this administration has identified.
Thank you. Look forward to continuing to work with you all.
Thank you. How about Glenn from American Sport Fishing Association?
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks everybody. I'm Glenn Hughes, American Sport Fishing Association, and really thanks for the presentation today. I really thought it was a nice job and has me excited about the future. It's apparent that the Forest Service is dialed in and is focused on the GAOA. I noticed in one of your slides, Jeff, that you mentioned one of the priorities is job creation and economic development. Obviously, there's a lot of projects out there planned, but can you give us any more detail as to how you will use the GAOA to create jobs and support economic development around the forest?
Sure. Thanks, Glenn. Just needed to get myself off mute. One of the things that I think our dashboard highlighted and that Jessica has and others have noted is how important it is to have solid data reflecting what the results are of our investments. And so we already have started to forecast what the job creation and economic benefits will be of our FY21 projects, and we'll continue to do so for subsequent years. For us working with Interior, it's important that we have quality data across all the agencies, because ultimately you don't want to just know what the projects and benefits are from the National Forest. You want to know what all the investments are producing in terms of job, economic growth, et cetera. But I think as well, we need to work with industry, as Callie pointed out, to appreciate and value what data exists outside of the federal government that can augment what we already have and are planning in terms of measuring. I know at the signing of the law, it was mentioned by the vice president at that time that the GAOA would create 110,000 new jobs. We'll see whether that's a low or a high estimate, but at the outset of the act being signed, it was clearly partly motivated by a desire to benefit local economies, many of which are in rural areas. I don't know whether I'm getting at your question, Glenn, except to say we're looking at all angles to have accurate and complete data. And I think since the Bureau of Economic Analysis started measuring the impact of outdoor recreation on the overall economy, we have a heightened attention to how critical it is to have good quality data for jobs and other metrics.
Thanks. And I just want to note we've had over 80 participants on the call and can stay with 80, which is pretty good for an hour-long Zoom, a year into Zooming. So this is obviously a really important conversation for our stakeholders, and just truly appreciate everyone's time. We have a couple questions from Felipe Benitez in the comments, and then a follow-up one from Teresa in the chat around diversity strategy. And so Felipe, I'll hand it to you, and then I'll say Teresa's comment unless she wants to chime in.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate the opportunity and the space. I just want to, I've seen a couple of questions on the chat box, and I think I'm grateful that there's this opportunity about, not only coming from the executive orders early on, but also, coming from Title IX from our civil rights, Title VI from the Civil Rights Act. But I'm worried that we may not be, or we may lose the opportunity to fully and meaningfully engage communities of color in the decision-making process. And if we want to benefit, as the executive order mentions, 40% of environmental justice or communities that have been left out, we need to make sure that they are part of this conversation. And I'm grateful to be part of this conversation today, but we need more voices. Not only me representing, I'm grateful to be here, but we need to make sure that we make the decisions with that input. I just want to make sure that that those vehicles, those opportunities for engagement are there, because otherwise we're gonna fall into and I'm sorry to say it, but a white savior complex where we'll tell you how can we benefit you, or how can we really need to make sure that input is. And I couldn't attend the NFF conversation last week, but I'm starting to get concerned that there's not enough, and again, might be that we have a separate conversations for communities of color, but more important, we need to make sure in all of the conversations our communities are represented. And I know, Jeffrey, I commend you for recognizing, commend you for knowing that that this is a challenge, but how can we right now, and it's a two-way street, I'm sorry. You want to make sure that you guys create the opportunities, and it's also part of our communities to step up to the plate and speak up. Otherwise, we're going to be left out, and all of these great intentions, all of these great checkbox that we need to now prevail are going to be a lost opportunity. So I really, really, and I'm sorry, it's not a question, but it's just a reflection of what I've heard. And again, not criticizing or not putting this, but we need more faces of those communities that are represented in these conversations.
Thank you for that. I couldn't agree more. If we were at a table, I would hope it would be a round one where there's equal representation and equal value. It's not our national forest, it's your national forest, and what we prioritize needs to reflect your priorities. I would welcome a conversation offline to understand better how we could meet the intent which you've described, which is our intent. I think there's some encouraging instances of investments in projects just from FY21 alone that are directly beneficial to underserved communities, whether they be tribes or Latino communities and others. But could we do better? Should we do better? Absolutely. And ultimately, it needs to be where you feel invested and you feel that you've had an equal part in where we're investing these funds. So if you'd be interested to explore this further offline, then I would welcome that follow-up conversation. I can say that our agency and our department, per the executive environmental justice executive order, is fully engaged in meeting the intent that the president has set forward. And I know our chief and leadership is dialed in on how we can reflect this, the priority of addressing racial inequities and better serving communities of color through our investments in GAOA. So let's have a conversation as a follow-up.
And I don't want to leave a bad impression. I recognize, and I'm actually partnering with the Forest Service in different areas and doing that. So I commend, and the intention is that we just want to make sure that it's across the board. And I apologize for exceeding my time.
It's all good. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And some more comments on that in the chat. So again, with the recording, we'll have all of this for the Forest Service, Jeff, so we can be sure that you have the chat comments as well, because I think this is an important conversation. As Felipe mentioned, I think it's important that it's part of every conversation, but it might be good, there might be an additional conversation to have on this side, just as we're thinking about, access. And there's a ton of data around COVID that I didn't get into, but around the communities that couldn't access the outdoors when they needed it most. And I know, Jeff, we've talked about this before, but how can GAOA, and maybe it's the LWCF side too, which I know you're going to have future conversations on, but create new opportunities for access in areas where, green space wasn't within 10 minutes. And when governors and president and everyone was saying, stay home, don't travel, stay close to home, but get outside, that wasn't a reality for millions of people. And I think through our work together, we can create that reality. I want to hand it over. We've got questions coming in the chat. I really appreciate that. Hands raising. I want to hand it over to Axie, who's the state director from New Mexico, who's actually done a lot of work on equity fund there and has maybe that connects to this somehow, because I know what we're really interested in is how state directors of recreation like Axie and her colleagues can really interact and work with you all to prioritize what's happening in the state and to look at state recreation as a whole in places like New Mexico. Axie can see and knows the need there, how she can best communicate with you, and that whole group of state directors can work with the federal government. And Axie, you probably have more to add to that, so I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks so much, Jess, and thanks for inviting me into this platform today. I really appreciate the vibrant discussion and the amazing presentation. So thank you. Jess brought it up, so I'll just talk about the New Mexico Outdoor Equity Fund very briefly. And hopefully folks on this call are familiar with it to some extent, but it's one of the things that keeps me most energized about this job and the chair that I sit in. And that was entirely the work of grassroots activists, primarily in the southern part of the state in Las Cruces, who had a vision for how to use outdoor recreation as a vehicle for social and climate justice. And they were the ones who got the state to buy into that vision and to invest in it and to turn it into a state program. But it all came about really through grassroots community activism and coalition building with a few leaders in particular. So just a plug for that, and happy to talk about that more offline as well. And I did have a question too that speaks to funding, and then what Jess had mentioned, the role that state directors might be able to play in this conversation. And I guess the question's twofold. And the first is really, how can we enhance the funding that we're talking about here with state and private dollars to make it go farther? And then the second part that's related, how can state recreation directors work to elevate state priorities for both LWCF and then also deferred maintenance funding?
Axie, thanks for the question. I did want to just mention, and I should have in the presentation, that for fiscal year 21, we sought out projects and value projects that had partner components to them. And we're projecting to have 150 million in partner contributions to augment the 285 million in project funds. So we'll continue to value and explore ways to build on that. And I would say we all know of state off-highway vehicle grants, state fishing license funding sources, other sorts of state level grant programs that we are tapping and can do more with. We've had a number of conversations with our partnership office and with a number of stakeholders like the partners that are on the call today, looking at some of the models, some of the best practices for bringing in private sector funding, whether from foundations, whether from working with, say, the National Forest Foundation on a voluntary surcharge when recreating at a ski area or whatnot that would be targeted toward a particular location and the facilities that are maintained there. So I think we have a lot of good examples from not just us, from the Park Service, from state parks, and now is the time to identify some of the best models that could be replicated elsewhere. I will say in just the last 3-4 years that I've been directly involved at a national level with the outdoor recreation program, I've been impressed by how active and growing the state outdoor recreation offices have been. We've had a number of meetings in person and by phone with that community. And I think our shared stewardship approach to how we manage land across jurisdictions, across landscapes fits perfectly with GAOA. As Jess and others mentioned, if we're making an investment in a road or trail that connects to adjoining state land or national park land, we need to be alert to what are the multiple benefits, what are the value add of each investment. And I think it's critically important at the state level that we're dialed in terms of whether our investments contribute to your priorities, whether there are other projects that might better meet our shared objectives.
Awesome. That's awesome to hear. I know that a lot of us on the call have been urging the creation of these state offices of outdoor recreation. I think the more governors can see that these offices are being utilized, and actually the more I think the federal agencies see that these offices have direct connections to the governors across the country, we can work really smartly with that shared stewardship goal of state and federal partnerships. And that's really going to help us achieve that, fixing the recreation backlog, the holistic approach, all of that, because no one knows recreation better than those state directors where they're located across the country. Kevin from NEFRA is on, and I see him, and I know you have a question.
Yeah, thanks, Jess. Yeah, Kevin Garden from the National Forest Recreation Association. And Jeff and Sherry, I just want to reiterate our thanks to you for spending the time with us today. And as we all know, all of the work that goes into a presentation like you gave us, there's a lot of information in those decks. So I'm glad we're going to get to look at them later because they're loaded with good stuff. But the question I have for you is kind of goes more to the nuts and bolts of the process. We talked about the various goals that the agency is looking at as far as a certain project, whether it be equitable or things like improving the visitor service or visitor experience or economic benefits. But when you have all of these really great projects in front of you, how do you go about figuring out which ones make the list? I mean, do you have a certain order as far as certain goals more important than the other? Are you looking for an even distribution? And then also, when you get down to the short list, which I'm sure is very difficult to get to because of all these really good projects, can you talk more about how you actually make that final decision? I think you mentioned metrics. Is there a scoring process? Or if you could kind of walk us through how that works from that perspective.
Sure. Thanks, Kevin, for the question. I always hesitate to get too far into the weeds, but let me try to hit this at appropriate level. We learned some things from our FY21 process, which was so compressed, and we didn't have the benefit of time that helped us a bit more in FY22. One thing that I noted in the presentation is we treat GAOA as part of an overall national asset management program. So at the same time, we're prioritizing funding through GAOA, we're looking at funding through our capital improvement and federal land transportation programs as well. So some projects will be funded out of those funding streams as opposed to GAOA. I'd also mention that 40% of our projects are what the regions identify as their top priorities. which reflect a mix of values and interests at the local forest level. As long as those projects reduce deferred maintenance and are otherwise consistent with the Act, 40% of our funds are really driven at that level, making it all the more important for us to connect you to the regions and forests where you have particular interest and attention. So for the remaining 60%, you're right, Kevin, we have a system set up to rank and prioritize projects. We've identified several what we call benefit areas that all relate to what's important in investing in the national forest and investing under this act. In particular, the highest priorities are focused on those projects that benefit recreation and access as one category, and those projects that contribute to rural economic development and jobs. We also are valuing projects that contribute toward forest management and sustainable resource use. We are also considering projects that contribute to our fire management program, but those are of lesser value overall. And then within each of those categories, there are several criteria that apply. And so we are further refining that process for FY23. But in a nutshell, focuses on projects that benefit recreation and access and projects that benefit rural economic development and jobs.
Right. Sandy Miller, I know you're on. Question?
Yes, thanks, Jess. Jeff, thank you for the discussion today. I'm Sandy Miller. I work for NIC Tyler Technologies. We are a partner providing recreation.gov. And Jess had a chance to kind of share the conversation of national strategy, and part of that being prioritization, transparency, inclusion, as Felipe was talking about. Do you believe there's a way to ensure that projects fit into an overarching recreation strategy so that there's a holistic approach when GAOA funding expires, rather than the patchwork system that might come about?
Sorry, Sandy, I was just taking notes as you were talking. So appreciate the question. And you're really getting at the core of what Chief Christensen expects of us as an agency, an overarching recreation strategy, and not something that is random acts of infrastructure improvements. I think, yes, your question, not only can we, but we should. I would say with a caveat, and that is that we are trying to address such a big problem, such a widespread problem, and we have, are you able to hear me okay? Yes. You are, okay. Such a widespread problem that we are challenged, I think, with the competing demands of trying to put some investment funds everywhere versus targeting our investments at hotspots or more critical areas. And we have had a lot of good dialogue internally and externally about which of those two approaches makes the most sense. I personally think that in order for us to achieve that overarching rec strategy, we need to target certain areas that can be demonstration areas, if you will, that have particularly high use, that have particular sensitivity to the condition of the resource in our assets. And if we improve those, then you're going to see a marked increase in the quality of the visitor experience. But when we talk about 40% of these funds going to where the regions identify their priority, results in something that's more scattered, that's not as focused around an overarching rec strategy. We're a decentralized organization that places a lot of value in what the forests identify as their priority needs, and we also have national scale priorities and areas of focus that we want to achieve. I think we need your help in how to steer through that complexity, and particularly to do so within 5 years so that we can deliver to Congress and the public something that looks like a coherent and effective and well thought out suite of investments.
Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate that. And you kind of lead me into one other question that I had, which in terms of, getting reauthorization, and as you said, some of this will be a little bit scattered just based on how the regions and the 40%. But are there specific things or successes that you think you would like, private to help you be able to, point out so that reauthorization of funds is possible? Are there things that you're thinking might be helpful?
So Jess alluded to this earlier. I want to come back to it, and that is, what are the stories that we're telling? What successes can we describe? And who are the right messengers to tell that story in a meaningful way that speaks not just to, okay, we improved this trail and this rec site and this trailhead, but how did the people in the community experience the national forest and the public lands, whether for the first time or feeling like they went to a place that was so much better, so much higher quality that the experience really changed. I think we need to look more outside than inside as to how well we tell the story. I don't think that's a strong suit of the Forest Service. And there are some ways in audiences that can be reached by partners that we don't always connect with as well. So I do think we have some best practices, some real model examples of the kinds of investments we're talking about. And we need to be working right now to try to capture those stories and give people a good sense of how things changed, who benefited, what the meaning of this investment was to local communities and businesses.
Absolutely agree. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Jess.
Yeah, and we'll certainly help you tell those stories. I think that the stories are really important, and we need to start ramping that up now, because as we think about the fund, we need to start talking about reauthorization not in 4 years, but probably in 1.5 years realistically, and that's a lot of work we have to get done in the next year that we can really speak to. There's a question from Scott Jones. So Scott, if you're on, I'll let you ask it, but I think it's really interesting because RTP is a priority for ORR, and many of the folks on this call obviously helps with horse, bike, hike, OHV, all kinds of trails, and it comes from the fuel tax of off-road vehicles. And so I know Scott has a question of how that interacts with the GAOA funds as it pertains to maintenance.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jessica. Jeff, good to see you. I wanted to just make maybe more of not a question, but a comment. Throughout the West predominantly, but certainly in snowmobile states as well, we have some pretty active partnerships that are more systemic than project driven. And just in a comment really, as we were working with the first 2 years of GAOA, project money, if there's a grant from the OHV program for this trail or that trail, that money, that was recognized quite well in those applications. But the more systemic, hiring of maintenance crews on the ranger district, contributions of weeks and weeks and weeks of youth corps time, or is this route kind of groomed by the snowmobile community in the wintertime for the public? That information did not seem to be as developed in the information that was coming up through the districts and the forests to the regional offices. And I was basically asking for a little help. If you guys could maybe prod people in the application to go, hey, is there something else in here that's more long-term, big picture type of funding, for the maintenance and long-term sustainability? Because we've already heard that we don't want to put a trail in and then 2 years from now we haven't maintained it and the trail is now functionally closed again. I think that's really an important component of that discussion, but not something that's been really highlighted in the process, and totally understand the short time frames and everything else. So just really a comment on that, because it would be really important to our folks, and I think the public as a whole, that information's into that process.
Thanks for that comment, Scott, and nice to see you. It might be good for us to connect offline to follow up on what you just shared. Certainly want to follow through with your point, and it does raise an important consideration. Deferred maintenance is one piece of a much larger aspect of how we maintain our infrastructure and physical assets. It's the day-to-day maintenance, so we don't accumulate more deferred maintenance. It's also where do we decide to invest funds in new facilities And so there's a whole array of how you maintain infrastructure in a healthy and sustained way. And so we certainly want to extend and renew GAOA, but we also are taking a fresh look at what sustainable asset management looks like over the long term.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah. And I mean, not only from that systemic kind of, we hire a lot of crews type of a component, but, you know, I mean, you guys have got a pretty aggressive time frame on your funding. And we've had a couple of projects that have come up as GAOA, at least interests from the districts and the users, that they're also coming to the state program for similar funding for the same project. And obviously it hasn't happened yet, but avoiding overlapping of funding sources for the same project for the same goals would also be a huge concern too.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thanks so much, Scott, for bringing that up. Teresa Martinez had to step off. She just messaged me that she really appreciates the conversation. It's been really valuable. And that, you know, there's that Next Gen 100 coalition that might want to follow up, and she'd be happy to coordinate that. So I know there's a couple, maybe more conversations to be had, and we're happy to facilitate those. We're happy to see others facilitate those, but a lot of appreciation, Jeff, for your time and for this conversation. I want to hand it over. I think Laurel is on, and she put a couple questions in the chat. Laurel, if you're on and want to raise your hand.
Hi, thanks everybody. Yeah, I had a couple of questions. I think one is around the need for national level standardized supply and demand outdoor recreation data. One, to inform the GAOA project selection and prioritization. Two, to inform federal, state, local outdoor recreation planning, and then also to inform any sort of national conservation goals associated with 30 by 30. What would it take to bring back and modernize the National Survey on Recreation and the Environment? This was, you know, previously under the Forest Service. We'd like to see that back and to meet the objectives that I outlined. I know that the Pacific Northwest Research Station is working with Auburn University to explore this, but it sounds like there's more that's needed. So maybe you can fill us in with some insight there.
Thanks very much for the question. National Survey on Recreation and the Environment. I would love to talk more with you as to what that would look like and how that would serve our ends. I think we're in a better place than ever, Laurel, with moving out on anything to do that would improve how we deliver outdoor recreation experience to the public. I've not, in my 30-year career, seen a time where there are many forces aligning, I think, to make these investments, to elevate the profile, and to get the kind of bipartisan support that, frankly, was something that led to the enactment of this law. That happens very rarely these days, and I think we have a real window of opportunity to build off of that, whether it be additional data collection or additional funding. So I'd like to talk offline with you to learn more about that concept.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jeff, and I'll definitely follow up with you. One more question related to some of the great work that you've been doing around the establishing shared stewardship agreements between the Forest Service and the states. How are those Forest Service and state partnerships informing GAOA prioritization, and is there work being done to intentionally align state priorities and goals outlined in the statewide comprehensive outdoor recreation plans as it relates to GAOA implementation? And I recognize that in this first round, there was a very short turnaround, and so there may not have been optimum conditions for partnership, but in the future, what will that look like?
Great question. Without question, the shared stewardship agreements that continue to be signed and put into place are really designed for the kind of expanded thinking about what we should be doing together to invest in our public lands. And a number of shared stewardship agreements, as you know, do specifically reference recreation. Some do not, but regardless, the chief made clear that all of our investments need to be viewed through that lens. So our efforts around public involvement were constrained last fall due to the time crunch that we were under. Our expectation now, through forums like this, through forest level public meetings, is that we are actively seeking out what the state views as its priorities. I think there's more we need to do despite being a decentralized organization, we do need some direction to ensure that every one of our regions is actively engaging with states as well as other partners as to where our highest priority investments need to go. That is reflected. The state's perspective is part of how we value where we invest our funds. But I'd welcome some ideas as to how we sort of institutionalize that coordination with the states.
And that's perfect segue to Colin from New Mexico, another state, from Nevada, another great state director who had put a question in the chat. Colin, if you're on, would love you to pipe up. Thanks.
Hey, Jessica, thank you so much. And Jeff and team, this is tremendous and a really needed conversation and so valuable. I think, Jeff, you addressed my question a little bit in terms of working more closely with the regions. And I think, from my perspective, where I sit in Nevada, the Humboldt-Toyabe is the largest national forest in the lower 48, but in that distribution map, it is less, the distribution to the HT is lower per land unit, let's say, than in other states. So I feel like there may be opportunities to leverage offices like Axes and mine to work with the regions more closely in terms of trying to, collate the strategies of diversity, equity, and inclusion, for example, like in a state like Nevada or New Mexico, where we have large populations of Latinx people, that strategy could be amplified, I guess, through those investments. So I would just welcome engaging on that with you and team as this conversation unfolds over the next couple of years. Thank you.
Thanks, Colin. We welcome that conversation. I know our acting recreation director, Dave Whittekind, would be, I think, very interested in joining me in that kind of dialogue. I think we're taking a bit of a breath from what we had to complete the first 6 months, and now is an opportune time for us to sit down with state outdoor recreation directors for the kind of exploration that you're talking about.
Awesome. I think I've gone through all of the questions that I see in the chat and the hands and folks who submitted questions beforehand. Is there anything else, I think from the Forest Service perspective, any learnings, I have a couple things, maybe closing remarks, and we can give one last opportunity for questions, but all I'm hearing is really great feedback. And Jeff, I think, you understand how valuable this is just to be able to have this kind of dialogue. And I hope everyone on the phone knows how rare it is that we get, kind of 2 hours to have this discussion. I know there's many other similar discussions with stakeholder groups. And so really appreciate the fact that we could focus on recreation here, because recreation is just, one piece to the deferred maintenance puzzle. I think one of the other things I've been thinking a lot about, which is probably something to put a pin in for a future conversation, but is, as you're working on non-recreation deferred maintenance projects, as the Forest Service is accomplishing, those roads and bridges projects and buildings, how are we utilizing FLORIA and other funds to continue to achieve recreation projects or RTP? And so I think, just thinking of deferred maintenance as one piece to a much bigger puzzle of recreation funding. And I'm excited as you, formalize the process and we better know how to insert ourselves and have a dialogue with you about the project selection. The projects that don't make it, or the important recreation sites that don't make it, how can we talk to you and your colleagues about FLORIA dollars for those, RTP dollars for those, the list of other places that we can get, and certainly don't need an answer for that yet. But I think as most of us have just really gotten up to speed on how recreation projects are funded as GAOA was getting passed and rolling out, I think there's more education to be had between our groups, between the federal government and stakeholder groups on just the other places that we can be communicating and having a dialogue around recreation funding. And I'd love to have that conversation at a later date, because I know you have your hands full with GAOA and there's some strict timelines, but I think this is just the beginning of hopefully, you know, a really long partnership with the Forest Service on recreation funding. Lots of thanks and appreciation. Jeff, can I hand it over to you and your team for any final thoughts?
Sure. Jess, thank you again for taking on the hosting of this call and for bringing together such a great group of people. ORR has been and continues to be an outstanding partner. We learn a lot from you. We gain a lot from your wisdom in terms of how to work with the legislative branch and how to position ourselves for success. So first and foremost, thank you for today. We are eager to continue a dialogue at all levels of the agency so as to learn together, to understand what priorities you have, to inform you as to some of the pressures and competing demands that impact us. This is needs to be a shared approach to a successful investment strategy and outcome. And so I would just encourage you, as we provide more information about how to engage at the forest level, at our regional level in the months ahead, to be active in doing so. And our expectation is that the forests are reaching out to you as well. So just know that this is a prime opportunity to influence our investments in FY23 and beyond. And we take seriously the feedback that you've shared with us today. I've taken quite a few notes and have a lot of follow-up to do. Chief Christensen and Deputy Chief Chris French at the outset identified the importance of setting up a small team, as was done in 2009 when the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act was passed, to target some of our efforts. And so just know that we do have a small team. You met Sherry Reeves today, but we have several others who are dedicated toward how do we fine tune our approach and have an outcome at the end of 5 years that looks coherent, that looks as though it has some rhyme and reason to our strategy. So more such conversations to come, more information through our website as to how you can engage and connect at the forest and regional level. And just thank you, have a number of follow-ups that we're going to need to pursue. I did want to invite Jen Eberlein, our Associate Deputy Chief, if Jen, you wanted to add to what I had shared.
No, well, as you can tell, we are very grateful and blessed to have Jeff help us lead this effort. So again, Jeff and the team, thank you. Jess and all the partners, thank you so much. This has been exactly what we were looking for, at least, and what I was hoping for is just how do we learn together and how do we work together as we move through this? So such great ideas, such great follow-up and comments and conversations. Really look forward to this. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much, you guys.
Thank you. And I'll be following up with everyone who was on the call today with deck and the materials, making sure you have the contact information that Jeff put up on the slides. And really, I hope this is part of a weekly, more realistically, maybe monthly or quarterly update that we can share back and forth on progress. But that dashboard is going to be invaluable and it just looks amazing. We are happy to update you on our progress and thinking through this work and just getting a ton of thanks. And so this is, you know, this should be the norm. It's not always the norm to be able to have these types of conversations. So I do know that this is a big, heavy lift on your end from the Forest Service. We really appreciate it. We look forward to talking about Lwcf also, because it's another great fun, maybe a similar conversation on Lwcf and hopefully, you know, something similar with the other agencies. You know, I think it's important to note that Forest Service is ahead of the game, even though you were behind, you know, in knowing that you even were going to get the funding to roll out. I haven't been thinking about this for 10 years, certainly ahead of the game in public outreach and transparency. And that's one of the key things for us, being able to continue to get people outside together. So appreciate the partnership, the dialogue, and we'll talk to everyone over email and hopefully see everyone maybe in person next time. So thanks so much.
Thank you.